This week, I'm looking at designing a long, narrow garden and how you can overcome the challenges that this type of garden presents in terms of creating a functional, beautiful design. Creating a good garden design is not about spending lots of money and trying to make it look like some sort of show garden. It's about understanding what the garden needs to deliver for you. And if it does that, the design is a good one. All any basic garden design needs is a place to sit, means to get there, and something nice to look at. But when you're dealing with long, narrow gardens, the range of options that we have are limited because the space is so restricted. So I'm going to give you some tips now as to how you can overcome that and what the problems are that you need to overcome so that you can create a design in your garden. All designs and redesigns start from the same basic principles. What are good things and what are the bad things and what have we got to change and what can we work with? So in this garden, some of the really nice elements are the fact that we've got this lovely window to the sky that's nice and bright, which contrasts with the dark conifers and the dark tiles and everything. We've got a really beautiful brick paving path, and we've got an attractive patio, so we want to keep those. Maybe this area needs a little rework. It was obviously put in because people were trying to create a slight raised border because the garden has a little bit of a slope to it. But it doesn't work really well, so maybe we have to keep it but just improve it and redesign it a little bit. Or we can look to get rid of it. So the areas that aren't working very well, clearly we have a rather unattractive fence feature. Now this may be your fence, it may be the neighbour's fence. We can't change it, so we've got to work with it. We've got to make this look better. Similarly, we have some very large, dark, overgrown conifers next door. We can't do anything about that. And they're creating a lot of shade in the garden. So we've got to find a way to work with that problem. Now, in terms of focal points, this is obviously a narrow garden. It's quite a long garden. But where are all the lines of the paving and the patio and the fence lines? Where's it all taking our viewpoint to? Well, it's quite obvious. It's this end fence. So this is where we have the first decisions that we have to make. In that, do we work with the focal points that we have? Do we look at creating something here worth looking at, which will emphasize the length and the narrowness of the garden, but it'll give us something really cool to look at? Or do we try and deflect from that particular problem? We try and make the garden feel wider because we want to give ourselves a feeling of more space so that we can put in different elements in the garden that make us look from one part to another part that may be taller or shorter, but the whole purpose being that we can't see from front to back in one hit. Our viewpoints will sort of flit from what's in here to maybe what's in this part of the garden. What's over here? Is there a different colour? It's all attracting your attention so that you're looking at different parts, and we're trying to stop that visual flow from front to back happening quite so quickly. Or we have to make a decision that we're not going to use this as the focal point at all. We're going to draw your attention elsewhere. We're going to make you look somewhere else, in which case we've got to use something that's really attractive and attention grabbing. So I've given you 3 different layouts for 3 different purposes here. So I'll just go through them. Incidentally, the circle here was that the customer had a hot tub that we had to put in, so that was just my size guide for how big the hot tub was going to be and where it was going to sit next to the patio. So we'll take the top one first of all. What have I done and why have I done what I've done? Well, in this instance, we've created a focal point at the end of the garden. Now, this was going to be something really visually look at me. It could be a water feature that had sound and movement. It could be a kinetic sculpture, something that moved with the wind. But we were embracing the narrowness of the garden by giving a straight path down to this feature. We're making you look here. Then along the side of the garden, we were just going to create planting blocks of different plants with different heights. So it was going to be quite contemporary and quite minimalist, all of which was saying, we know that this is a long, narrow garden. We know that we can't change that, but I'm going to give you something that's so cool to look at, you're not going to notice the narrowness. And we're going to break that narrowness up by giving you a few really deep planting areas. The second garden takes on board this visual punctuation process. So once again, as you're looking into the garden, we're creating different borders. Now these could be flat on the ground, or they could be raised up above the grass, all of which is going to give you a different view as you look down the garden. The idea then being that we can't sit and see from one to the other. So your view is being taken to different places as you go down the garden. It's stopping you looking all the way to the end in an instant. Now, obviously, in terms of a maintenance element, mowing round some of these borders is a little more tricky. So those are questions that you need to consider. Or maybe you would lose the lawn altogether and just have shingle or some other medium that you would then have these raised borders in. But we would use texture and colour and height to make the garden more interesting as a view all the way down. Now, the third and last example shows you the principle of creating and diverting your view somewhere else. This was also the cheapest option, in the sense that what we're trying to do is create a design with no changes to the hard landscaping. So although we had that shingle feature, as you saw at the beginning, that would be improved and beautified, and we could put some nice pots or something on there to make it an attractive feature. But we weren't going to change it. Instead, we were going to redefine the shape of the lawn and really demonstrate the fact that this is a long, narrow lawn. We're not trying to hide that fact altogether, but by shifting it this way, we were going to create a big, wide border along that fence. And this was going to be filled with plants that were going to say, look this way, look over here. I'm going to capture your attention at this bit. And because we had a deeper planting on the slope, it would give the impression that this part of the garden was slightly wider. So let me show you what I mean. And I will get rid of those sketches. So if we go back to our original picture, if I start by taking out all of the clutter, this is the bits of the garden that we might be changing or working with. So the stone area, we were going to rejiggle and just reformat it within the shape of the new lawn. So let me put in how the lawn would fit into this garden. So we really are making a feature of the narrowness. We're making the lawn point this way, but we're not going to work with that focal point. We're going to change the focal point, and I'm going to give you plants that will grow and disguise the boundary. So let me throw in what we did. Very obviously, you can see that I have changed the colour of this fence. It's no longer shed red. And what we've done is we've made it the same colour as the paving to try and join those areas together. And because the conifers are dark, the fence is now dark, which makes the planting in front of the fence stand out. There's been a small hedge put at the end of the garden, which disguised the ugly bit of the fence that we couldn't see. And it's going to be a different colour to the leaf colour that comes out from the actual hedge that's already there. So we're going to create a contrast there. So I think you can see that it's made this garden feel wider, even though we actually haven't done much to it. I thought I'd show you another example of designing narrow gardens, and this one, as you can see, is even longer and even narrower than the last example. And this throws up problems because we don't have a lot of width to play with in a garden. So if we start adding big borders in, it's just going to make the whole garden feel quite enclosed and claustrophobic. We've got to find a different way to give the impression of width without using up valuable ground space that we need to be able to walk on. Now, in this instance, this particular garden had a beautiful games room that was at the end of the garden, and the client had created a pathway from one end of the house to the end of the garden. Now, although the path's perfectly functional, what I wanted to show you was that if you put a central path in to any narrow space, what happens is that we actually create two narrower spaces either side of the pathway. Each one is not wide enough really to do anything with, and so we get stuck just accentuating the negative element of this garden and making it feel just like a tunnel right down to the end. There's nothing there to capture our attention. We can't do anything because the path's in the way. How are we going to get round that problem? What are we going to do that's going to eliminate it? Well, there are two main takeaways from this that you need to think about. The first one is what we're trying to do is at some point we're trying to provide some form of barrier that stops you from seeing everything in the garden in one hit. It creates a little bit of a what's round there or what's over here curiosity. And it's not a big dense barrier, it's just a punctuation point. It's something that stops your focal point literally coming from here and straight down to the end. We want to slow it down. We want to make you meander. We want to make you look. So that's the first thing that we have to do. The second is obviously we have to get down this garden. It's got to be practical. It's got to be useful. It's got to be sensible. It's got to be accessible. So the path that we put down this garden has to feel like it's something that we would walk down anyway. If we make it a really weird angular shape or something like that, we're just not going to walk on that sort of route. It doesn't make sense. So we have to find two practical methods to make our view slow down and meander, and then still give us a sensible, this feels right pathway. So I'm going to show you now that if I add 2 square lawns to this garden, automatically we have a route from the patio down to the games room. We go straight and we can walk past one lawn area and then a secondary lawn area which could have a different function. This one could be for adults and this one could be for children, for example. So that ticks one box about creating a route and a pathway. So if I put in the path, then we've got to deal with the next bit. And if you remember, I said we've got to find something that just halts our view somehow. We've got to have a stopping point. And we haven't got that yet because everything is too flat. It's all one-dimensional around the lawn and up the sides of the fences. So we need some height somewhere. And we can introduce that by adding something like a pergola. So now we can walk down and we can walk through. There was this tree that the customer already had, which we can put in the garden, that we can just walk past to our games room. So things are beginning to look a bit better. Well, let me put an alternative. From the original design, I've got a few plants that we've got in here and we can walk along the path and up to the shed. That's all fine. But the reality of what will probably happen is that people walk straight across this lawn and straight down the side there. So we are not necessarily going to make people go that way. And because we've got some lower planting here, other than the tree, there's nothing really to stop that visual view to the end of the lawn. So it's getting there, but it's not 100% okay so far. So if I move you to this design, and this is the one that the actual customer decided to take in the end. We extended the patio and then put the pathway on an angle because it felt much more of a gentle route through to the garden room at the end. It was less angular, but we also gave the option of walking through a lawn, or in this case we were going to put a meadow in, and we could access a small patio area from two routes. So even if somebody comes out and walks straight into the garden, they can't access the rest of the garden from this point. So they're going to have to use the route to get to the games room. It will help give the garden a bit more width. We've then used some triangular raised borders here that will help lift the planting up into our eye line, because one of the things about narrow gardens is we just don't have a lot of space for really big plants. It will be claustrophobic if they close us all in. So what we want are upright plants that are really interesting, that will capture our attention but won't take horizontal space, but will use vertical space. So if I throw that in now, and you'll begin to see, this was the unplanted design. So you can see now we've got a pathway into a little patio, which we can access through the pergola as well. We can then walk along the garden, and then we have to go sideways past some raised planters, which will have our sensory plants in. And we can't access the games room, via this part of the lawn. We have to go round. So we're just creating a journey that is a little more interesting. We've added the pergola, where plants can grow along these wires, which will give us a little roof and a little tunnel to go under. So the plants here will be the thing that we notice. So we'll have some plants in there that might be attractive to look at, or they'll dance with the wind and move, but something that just catches your eye line, so that we're not looking from one end of the garden to the far end in an instant. And the customers also had bought this artificial light tree, which again stops you in your tracks halfway down the lawn and says, look at me at night time, before you then go and see the end view down here. So I'll just show you what it looked like in the end. And here we have the garden finished, and I hope you can see that we've packed a lot in, but we haven't used a lot of space. And because there are lots of interest down here with colour, and we've got movement which contrasts with the static nature of the fences, the actual fences themselves don't seem to be quite so imposing anymore, because you're looking somewhere else. And that's how you design a long, narrow garden. When you are beginning to design any long, narrow garden, the first thing you need to consider is the focal point. Are you going to embrace the narrowness and draw your eye straight to the end with something really impressive? Or are you going to slow down the visual flow from one end of the garden to the other by using punctuation marks in terms of the plants or elements that you put in the garden? Or are you going to try and distract from the narrowness by creating another part of the garden that you want to look at that isn't at that end point? And you can do that in lots of different ways. With plants, you need to use tall, narrow, upright plants that aren't too dense. You want to be able to see through them a little bit. And use plants that will move so that you watch them. You can use screens that will block off parts of the view, but have these that are only partial impediments. You should be able to see through them to give you the impression there's something the other side. And use pergolas as well. These are very valuable for getting height and extra planting into the garden, and they can frame small views that you want to highlight. And lastly, the path all the way down. It has to still feel like a sensible, normal route. Otherwise, you're not going to walk down it. You're going to bypass. So if you follow these simple principles, it will help you redesign your garden better. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you found the video useful. If you want more information, please visit the website plantplots.com. There's loads of different design advice on all sorts of gardens. You can look at the gardens I've designed, and there's also planting plans that can help you choose the plants for your garden. And if you do like the videos, please do hit the subscribe now button. Thanks for watching.